In today's video, I'm going to share with you two famous and very disturbing accounts of what just might be lurking beneath the surface of the Ohio River. You won't want to miss this one. On the afternoon of August 28, 1955, a man in an Air Force uniform stood at the front door of a small house on Fountain Avenue in Evansville, Indiana. The woman who answered the door was 35-year-old Naomi Johnson. She took one look at this man's uniform and immediately felt her stomach drop. Because in 1955, when military personnel showed up at your door unannounced, it usually meant that somebody was dead. But the man quickly told Naomi that he wasn't there with bad news. He was there to ask her some questions about an incident that had occurred the previous week, an incident at the Ohio River. Now, Naomi was confused because, yes, something had happened to her at the river, something that had left her with injuries that were still healing. But she couldn't understand why the Air Force would care about her, swimming incident. I mean, the Air Force does deal with planes and missiles and national defense. They don't really investigate swimming incidents. But this colonel, and he insisted he was a colonel, though he never actually showed Naomi any identification, he seemed to know details about what had happened to her that she hadn't told anyone except her husband and her friend who'd been there. Very specific details. So Naomi invited him in, and she and her husband Darwin sat in their living room while this supposed colonel pulled out a small notebook and just began asking questions, really specific questions. And then he asked her something that deeply shook her. He asked her about the markings. Naomi hadn't told anybody about the markings, not the doctor who treated her injuries, and not the reporter from the Evansville Press who'd interviewed her, because the markings were so strange that she was convinced that people would think she was crazy if she mentioned them. But somehow, this person claiming to be an Air Force colonel knew about them. So when Naomi asked him how he knew about the markings, he didn't answer. He just stared at her and said that what happened to her was now classified as a matter of national security, and she was not to discuss it with anyone, ever, period. 7 days before, on August 21st, 1955, it was one of those brutally hot summer days in Indiana where the humidity makes it feel like you're breathing through a wet towel. 35-year-old Naomi Johnson had been looking forward to this particular Sunday afternoon all week. She was a housewife, and during the week, she was very busy taking care of her 13-year-old son. Keeping the house, all the usual stuff. But on Sundays after church, she had this tradition with her friend Chris Lamble. They would drive down to the spot on the Ohio River just outside Evansville and go swimming. This wasn't like a beach or anything. This was just a spot where people had been swimming for years. There was a grassy area that kind of sloped down to the water. There was some shade and some trees, and the water was usually pretty calm, perfect for cooling off. Naomi and Chris had brought Chris's mother-in-law along, Lena Lamble, though Lena wasn't planning on swimming. She was just going to sit in the shade and watch some neighborhood kids who were playing in the yard. Now, Chris had brought her inner tube, one of those big black, rubber ones, and by the time Naomi arrived, Chris was already in the water, floating around, laughing as these waves from a passing towboat rocked her up and down. So Naomi waded in, and immediately, the cool water was such a relief from the heat. She swam out to where Chris was floating, maybe 15 feet from the shore, and the water was about 8 feet deep there, murky brown like the Ohio River always is, but Naomi didn't mind. She'd been swimming in this river her whole life. So the two women, they treaded water next to each other, and Chris was telling Naomi this story about something that had happened at church that morning, something about the pastor's wife and a cake that had fallen or something. They were both laughing, and immediately, Naomi felt something brush against her leg. Now, when you're swimming in a river and something touches your leg, your first thought is generally a fish or a stick or something. Naomi just kind of kicked her leg a little to push whatever it was away and kept listening to Chris's story. But then she felt it again, and this time it didn't feel like something randomly bumping into her. It felt deliberate, like something had touched her leg on purpose. And so she stopped listening to Chris's story and looked down at the water, but of course she couldn't see anything. The Ohio River is brown. Visibility is 0. So she's just looking at brown water. And she's about to say something to Chris like, "Hey, did you feel that?" when something suddenly grabbed her knee. And I need to be really clear about what I mean when I say grabbed. I don't mean something wrapped around her leg like seaweed. I mean something bumped into her. Something grabbed her knee the way a hand would grab her knee. And she could feel distinct pressure points like fingers. But before Naomi could even go through the motions of what she was feeling, before she could scream or even warn Chris, whatever had grabbed her knee pulled down hard. So Naomi went under, she inhaled water instead of air, she's starting to panic, and now she's underwater, she's choking, and something has a grip on her knee so strong that she cannot break free. She continues to panic, she's now thrashing around, trying to kick with her free leg, trying to hit whatever's got her, but she can't see anything, it's too murky. During all the chaos, she's churning up the mud and silt in the water, so it's even worse. And now the grip on her knee is getting tighter, and she could feel what seems like nails or something sharp pressing into her skin through her bathing suit, and the pain is intense. But somehow, Naomi would later say she didn't know how she did this. She managed to twist her body in just the right way so that whatever was holding her lost its grip for just a second. And that second was enough. She shot up to the surface, coughing and gasping, and Chris, who's still floating in her inner tube just a few feet away, sees Naomi come up and immediately knows something's wrong. Her eyes are huge, she's coughing up water, she's freaking out, and she's looking around frantically like she's expecting something to surface and come after her. Chris started to paddle over to her, asking what happened, but before she could even answer, she felt that same pressure on her knee again, that same kind of deliberate grip. And this time, because Naomi was still above water, she screamed. But the scream was cut short because, again, she was yanked under. And this time, whatever had her was pulling her deeper, and she could feel herself being dragged down, and the pressure in her ears was getting painful. And she's kicking and thrashing as much as she can, but the grip on her knee is now like a vice. And she's running out of air. She already inhaled water once, her lungs were burning, and she knew that she was about to drown, that this is the time to make peace with God because she didn't have much time left. Naomi remembered Chris's inner tube, and so with the last bit of strength she had, she reached up, she could see the dark shadow of the inner tube directly above her, and she grabbed it with both hands, and she pulled herself up with such force that her body actually came out of the water. And when her body hit that inner tube, it made this loud slapping sound. Whatever it was holding her let go. But she didn't wait to see if whatever had grabbed her was coming back. She swam to shore faster than she'd ever swum in her life, and Chris was right behind her, paddling frantically in her inner tube. So when Naomi reached shallow water, she basically crawled up onto the beach. She was hyperventilating, her whole body was shaking, and her knee was on fire from pain. And Leah Lamble, remember Chris's mother-in-law, she'd seen the commotion from where she was sitting, and she came rushing over, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, what happened?" And the three women looked at Naomi's knee, and there were deep scratches all around it, and it looked like something with claws had grabbed her. The skin was already bruising, there's turning purple and black in some spots, and there was even blood coming from several puncture wounds. Chris ran to get alcohol from their beach bag, and they poured it over the wounds, which burned terribly, as you can imagine. And while they were doing this, Naomi kept saying that something grabbed her, something with hands. Something strong enough to pull her under and hold her there. But, Chris and Lena, they didn't know what to make of this because what Naomi was describing just didn't make any sense. I mean, there's nothing in the Ohio River that has hands. I mean, there's catfish, but catfish don't grab people. They got Naomi home, and Darwin, her husband, took her to the doctor. The doctor cleaned and bandaged the wounds and said it looked like she'd been grabbed by something, but what? He had no idea. And he just assumed that maybe she'd gotten tangled in some, submerged cables or something, that she was crazy, but he didn't really have an explanation. But Naomi knew that whatever happened, it wasn't normal. And in fact, it was so abnormal that her story apparently made the local paper, the Evansville Press. And the headline was something like, "Local woman attacked by unknown creature in Ohio River." And for a few days, people talked about it. Some people thought it was a catfish. Some people thought maybe it was a snapping turtle, but 7 days later, we're back in Naomi's living room now with the Air Force colonel, and he's asking her all these questions, writing everything down in his little notebook. And some of his questions made sense. I mean, he wanted to know exactly where this happened, what time, who was there, that kind of thing. But then his questions got weird because he started asking Naomi if she had noticed any unusual aircraft in the area that day. She hadn't. And he asked if she'd seen any strange lights in the water. She hadn't. He asked if she'd felt any electrical sensations when she was grabbed. And of course, Naomi was like, "What do you mean electrical sensations? What are you talking about?" Then the colonel asked the question that really threw Naomi. He asked her if there'd been any unusual markings left on her skin after the attack. Markings that couldn't be explained by simple scratches or bruises. Naomi and Darwin looked at each other because there had been something they hadn't told anyone about, something so strange that they thought people would think they were crazy if they mentioned it. The colonel noticed the look between them, and he leaned forward and said, "Tell me about the markings." Now, here's the thing that Naomi hadn't told anyone. When they got home that day, and Naomi was cleaning her wounds, she noticed something on the back of her knee. Right where that thing had grabbed her, there was this mark on her skin. It wasn't exactly a bruise or a scratch, but it was like this bright green, like the color of algae, but it was darker, and it was in the shape of a handprint. But not a normal handprint. The palm was too wide, and the fingers were really long, and at the tips, where the fingers would be, there were very distinct marks, like claw marks. Darwin attempted to wash it off, thinking maybe it was just algae or something, but it wouldn't come off. They scrubbed it with soap, alcohol, everything they could think of, but this green palm print stayed on Naomi's skin like it had been tattooed there. And it lasted for like 2 weeks, and then gradually it faded away. When Naomi told the colonel about this green palm print, his whole demeanor changed. He stopped writing and he just stared at her. And then he asked her to describe it in detail. The exact size, the color, the exact shape, everything. So when she was done, the colonel closed his notebook, stood up, and he told Naomi and Darwin that what happened to her was now classified. They were not to discuss it with anyone, not with the press, their friends, nobody. Darwin, who was very confused by this, asked why. What did the Air Force care about something that had happened in the Ohio River? And he just said that Naomi wasn't the first, that there had been others, and they all had the same thing in common. He left after making Naomi and Darwin promise again not to talk about it. And, for years they didn't. But in the 1970s, an investigator named Terry Colvin, who researched unexplained phenomena, heard about Naomi's case and tracked her down. Now, by this time, she was in her 50s, and she figured that enough time had passed that she could tell the whole story. When she did, Terry was fascinated because he'd been researching similar incidents for years at this point. People grabbed by unknown things in rivers and lakes, people pulled under by things that simply shouldn't exist. Here's what Terry discovered. Between 1955 and 1975, there were at least 12 reported incidents in the Ohio River Valley of people being grabbed by something underwater. Most of these people had simply been too scared to report it officially. Terry tried to track down the Air Force colonel who had visited Naomi. He filed a Freedom of Information Act request. He contacted various military bases, but he could never find any record of the military ever investigating such a thing. Officially, it never happened. Miss Naomi Johnson lived until 1998. She never went swimming in the Ohio River again. Her friend Chris Lamble, who had been there that day, would occasionally try to talk to Naomi about what happened, but Naomi would just shake her head and change the subject. It was something she didn't want to remember. Whatever grabbed her in the Ohio River in 1955 is still there, and apparently, someone in the government knows what it is, but they're not telling. Unfortunately, whatever it is lurking beneath the surface of the water remains a mystery. In the summer of 1891, fishermen along the Ohio River in Indiana started telling some pretty wild stories. Now, if you know anything about fishermen, they have a tendency to embellish. The fish was this big, that sort of thing. It's kind of part of the job description, but the stories coming out of this little town called Vevay, it was just something else entirely. But let me back up. Vevay, Indiana in 1891 was this really quiet little river town where basically nothing ever happened. I mean, maybe 1,600 people lived there, and most of them made their living from either the river or from farming. The Ohio River was everything to this community. It's where they fished, it's how they transported goods, it's where their kids played during the summer. And the fishermen, of course, being as experienced as they were, they knew every part of the river, every bend and sandbar, and all the good fishing spots for miles in either direction. When fishing started going bad in early summer of 1891, it was kind of a big deal. Initially, it's just a part of the season, right? It happens. Maybe the spring rains had affected the fish patterns. Then they started to notice something else. All around certain areas of the river, they kept finding these massive piles of mussel shells and fish bones, like way more than normal. And the strange thing was that these weren't in places where fishermen would dump their cleaning scraps. These were in random spots, especially around these things called snags. Now, snags were basically clusters of waterlogged trees and stumps that stuck up out of the water when the river was low. The government had actually special boats that would pull dead trees out of the main shipping channel and kind of just pile them up in the shallow areas to keep the river clear for boat traffic. So you had these tangled masses of old wood sticking up like broken teeth all along parts of the river. They were ugly and they were a pain to navigate around, but they were just part of the landscape. The fishermen are all finding these shells and bones, and they're beginning to wonder, is something living in there? You know, maybe river otters had moved in, maybe a kind of predator. One morning in the early summer, a fisherman by the name of Thomas Garrett heads out before dawn to check his lines near one of these snag-filled sandbars. And it's important to understand that Thomas, of course, has been fishing in these waters his entire life. You know, his father was a fisherman, his grandfather was a fisherman. This guy knows the river. So he's out there, and it's one of those mornings where the mist is so thick that you could barely see 10 feet in front of you. And he's pushing his little boat toward the sandbar where he's got lines set, and he sees movement in the snags. He figures it's a deer because sometimes deer do swim out to these little sandbars, especially if they're being chased. But as Thomas gets closer and the mist starts to thin out, he realizes that it's not a deer. And according to Thomas, look, this is where the story gets weird. According to Thomas, there were two things on the sandbar, and he couldn't tell you exactly what they were. They were about 5 feet long, they were on all fours, and they had this yellowish skin that was kind of glistening in the dim morning light. And he would swear this until the day he died, that when one of them moved, when one of them reached up to its mouth with what would have been a paw, it wasn't a paw, it was a hand, like a human except with webbing between the fingers. Thomas said he must have made a noise, like maybe he gasped or something, because one of these things turned and looked right at him. And their faces were like human, but just distorted. I mean, they had pointed ears and they were ugly and they looked, aquatic. Basically, when they turned and saw him, they just slipped down into the water. They didn't dive. They kind of just sank down like stones would, barely making a ripple. Thomas, who's completely freaked out by this, rows back to shore as fast as he can, and he tells everybody what he saw. And as you can imagine, people react exactly how you think they would. He's either lying or he's a drunk, or both. Now, this is 1891, so people didn't really have a framework for, I saw something that shouldn't exist, right? They just assumed Thomas is making it up because he was bored. Thomas is shaken, visibly shaken. And people who knew him, they were saying, look, something scared this man. Maybe he didn't see exactly what he thought he saw, but he definitely saw something. And so over the next few weeks, more people start reporting sightings. A couple on a riverboat saw something swimming alongside the boat that wasn't a fish, and you had a group of kids playing near the river, and they supposedly saw these yellowish things on a sandbar that ran away when they got closer. There was another fisherman who claimed that he saw them feeding on mussels, using their hands to try and pry open the shells. All these different encounters and experiences point to the same thing, but what's really interesting is that all the accounts have the same key points. Yellowish skin, about 5 feet long, 4 limbs but moving kind of human-like, webbed hands, pointed ears, and always around the snags. Now, you know how these things usually go, right? I mean, one person sees something and suddenly everybody's seeing it. So mass hysteria. Now, this is probably where the story would have ended, but there's a twist. In late summer of 1891, a visitor came to Vevay. He was there on business. something to do with organizing an event in town. And while he was there, he heard the stories about these strange sightings, and instead of dismissing them like any rational person would, this visitor decided that he was going to see for himself. So he starts going down to the river, and not just once, but multiple times. And he finds the spots where the sightings had been reported, specifically near the snags. And he just waits, and he sits on the riverbank for hours watching. The first day, nothing. The second day, nothing. But he's insistent and also patient, and he keeps coming back. Several visits into this, he finally has a sort of sighting. Now, according to this man, around dusk, two of these things emerge from the water about 20 feet from where he's sitting, and they don't see him at first. They're focused on eating. They're picking up mussels from the shallow water and using their clawed hands to try and pry them open and eat the meat. And this visitor, he does something interesting, right? He pulls out a pencil and paper and he starts sketching what he's seeing. And for several minutes, he just watches and draws. And he's noting details in the way they move and the way they use their forelimbs like arms and just how their bodies taper to a point at the back. Not like a tail, but not like an animal that he's ever seen. And he even estimates that their weight is about 150 pounds each. They're very strange animals. He even notes that one appears to be male and the other female, though he would later admit he couldn't explain exactly how he knew that. He observes that about a third of the way down their bodies, there's this mass of coarse hair, kind of like a mane, but their heads are completely hairless. And the heads were probably the scariest part because they were so close to human, but they weren't. I mean, besides their proportions and the fact they looked like an aquatic version of a human, they just had a terrifying look. The face was slack and expressionless, and there was really no intelligence in the dark eyes, and they had these kind of sharp teeth. At some point during all of this, one of these things notices him, and instead of fleeing immediately like they had with Thomas Garrett, this one, the male, the visitor thought, made what he described as a menacing gesture. Maybe it bared its teeth, maybe it made a sound, but whoever the guy is, the visitor, he wasn't entirely clear, but he got the message. Basically saying, I see you and you need to leave. The things then sank into the water with that strange motion and they completely vanished. When you hear this, you're probably thinking the same thing that I first thought was, okay, whatever, big deal, right? But if you add it to the pile with all the other sightings, this right here is where the story takes a very unexpected turn. The visitor who saw these creatures and sketched them was not just a random guy. He was a captain actually, named J.M. Ozier, or Ozier, however you want to pronounce his name. And he was a former Confederate officer from Covington, Kentucky. He was an educated man who managed a traveling art exhibition. Someone, who understood the difference between observation and imagination. Somebody who knew how to document what they were saying. And he didn't just sketch these things. He took very detailed notes, measurements, behavioral observations. He wrote everything down, the texture of their skin. He described how it was rough like elephant hide below the forelegs, smoother and more yellow around the face and neck. The way they swam, barely disturbing the water. I mean, just so many little details. He even made a comparison that would have meant something to people in 1891. He said the face reminded him of an exhibit he'd seen, P.T. Barnum's famous What Is It? Attraction, also called Zip. Now, if you don't know what that is, look it up. It's unsettling. He took all of his findings and he sent in all the complete notes and everything to a newspaper, specifically not any newspaper that would take it, but the Cincinnati Enquirer, which is one of the major newspapers of the time in the region. Now, they didn't publish his account as a letter to the editor. They didn't put it in the entertainment section. They published it as news, as fact, with the headline, The Vevay Mud Mermaids, though that name would just later become the Mud Mermaids of the Ohio River. And so by the end of 1891, there were no new sightings of these mud mermaids. The fishermen went back to finding their normal amounts of fish. The piles of mussel shells around the snags had been washed away. Or maybe there was something else that had happened to them, but what? Nobody's sure. The newspapers ran a few follow-up stories, and there was one that even suggested the sightings had to have been misidentified river otters. I mean, come on. when people confronted the captain about this, and they're like, you clearly just misidentified river otters, stop trying to perpetuate this nonsensical cryptid stuff, he just thought that it was just completely ridiculous because he knew what otters looked like. He saw that these things had hands and that they were very human-like with their features, and how they used their hands and claws like tools, to open mussels. And even more fascinating is this captain never changed his story. The other witnesses, Thomas Garrett and the rest, they stuck to their stories too. And the fact that all of them independently described the same creatures. I mean, that is hard to explain away. So what exactly are the Ohio mud mermaids? Well, I don't know. Nobody does. Were they some species that briefly lived in the Ohio River and then vanished? I mean, were they something that had always been there but only showed themselves for that one summer? Were they connected somehow to P.T. Barnum's exhibits, either inspiring them or inspired by them? Well, we don't really have any answers to those questions. Unfortunately, folks, it remains a mystery. And because you guys made it this far, I want you to all comment below, rolling on the river. So that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we deep dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.